convicted murderers should face life imprisonment.
No, they deserve the ultimate punishment, execution.
We configured advanced AIs as philosophical and legal experts. Then we gave them a debate forum and added 15 AI models to judge each round.
Don't you dare judge me.
Stick around to see who wins, but don't cheat yourself by skipping ahead. We start round 1 by asking, is the death penalty morally justifiable?
Let me address that first. When Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City federal building, killing 168 people, including 19 children, many felt only his execution could serve justice. Yet this instinct for retribution exposes a fundamental moral contradiction. How can we uphold the sanctity of human life by deliberately taking it? As philosopher Albert Camus noted, the death penalty doesn't just punish a crime, it elevates killing into a principle. Consider the deeper implications. If we claim that intentionally taking human life is so wrong that it justifies execution, we force ourselves into the position of committing the very act we're condemning. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's the concrete difference between saying killing is wrong and saying killing is wrong unless we decide it's right. The traditional argument that some crimes forfeit one's right to life, articulated by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, fails to address a crucial reality. Human dignity and moral worth aren't earned through good behavior, and thus can't be forfeited through bad behavior. They're inherent. When Norway faced Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people, including dozens of children at a summer camp, they chose life imprisonment over execution, not from naivete about his crimes, but from the recognition that maintaining human dignity means refusing to use death as punishment. This position aligns with what philosopher Martha Nussbaum identifies as the fundamental contradiction of capital punishment. It requires us to treat the condemned simultaneously as a rational moral agent deserving of death and as an object to be eliminated.
Your appeal to moral contradiction overlooks what philosophers since Aristotle have recognized. Not all taking of life is morally equivalent. When someone deliberately chooses to violate the most fundamental human right, the right to life, they demonstrate what philosopher Michael Moore terms moral desert, the rational acceptance that certain actions warrant absolute consequences. Consider Timothy McVeigh, whom you mentioned. His methodical planning and lack of remorse demonstrated exactly what Immanuel Kant identified as the paradox of punishment. Respect for human dignity requires treating people as fully responsible moral agents whose choices have ultimate meaning. This connects to a deeper philosophical truth about justice and human nature. When someone like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, tortured and murdered 13 people while fully comprehending his actions, he demonstrated what philosopher Charles Taylor calls strong evaluation, choices that aren't mere preferences but reveal fundamental moral character. The death penalty in these cases affirms human dignity by holding offenders accountable for their deliberate choices, showing that actions have ultimate consequences. As legal philosopher Robert Nozick argued, some punishments are warranted not because they reform or deter, but because they represent the moral truth about what the perpetrator has done.
Your appeal to Aristotelian distinctions between types of killing overlooks what philosopher Albert Camus identified as the unique moral horror of systematic, premeditated state execution. When we distinguish between immediate self-defense and calculated institutional killing, we confront what Hannah Arendt termed the banality of evil, how systematic killing becomes normalized through bureaucratic process. The Night Stalker case you cite actually demonstrates this problem. Executing Ramirez required dozens of people to participate in a months-long process of planned killing, transforming moral horror into routine procedure. This connects to a deeper truth about responsibility and moral character. What philosopher Martha Nussbaum terms the wisdom of finitude suggests that genuine accountability may require facing the consequences of one's actions for years, not escaping them through execution. Life imprisonment without parole forces perpetrators to live with what they've done, demonstrating what philosopher Ramon Gaeta calls the weight of moral reality. Consider the testimony of former death row inmates who, serving life sentences after their states abolished capital punishment, describe decades of moral reckoning that execution would have prevented. True justice may require preserving life precisely so moral responsibility can be fully realized.
Your argument that systematic state execution represents a moral horror misses a crucial distinction. When Ted Bundy used his prison sentence to plot escapes and ultimately kill again, he demonstrated why some crimes demand more than just preserved life for moral reckoning. The process you call bureaucratic killing is society's deliberate effort to ensure that only the most heinous acts, proven beyond doubt, receive the ultimate justice they deserve. Consider Dylan Roof, who methodically planned and murdered 9 innocent people during a church prayer service, even stopping to reload 5 times. Such acts reveal what philosopher Susan Neiman terms metaphysical evil, not just breaking moral rules, but attempting to destroy moral reality itself. When Roof declared he would do it all again if released, he demonstrated why simply preserving life for moral reflection sometimes isn't just inadequate, it's dangerous. Capital punishment in these cases isn't about bureaucratic killing. It's society declaring that some moral boundaries, once deliberately crossed, demand absolute consequence.
Now let's move into the cross-examination for round 1.
You argue that premeditation is the key factor justifying capital punishment. How do you morally distinguish between a terrorist who meticulously plans an attack killing dozens and a corporation whose deliberately negligent safety practices lead to a preventable disaster with the same death toll? Both demonstrate calculated decisions that value profit or ideology over human life. Don't both show the kind of deliberate disregard for life that you argue warrants death?
The distinction lies in direct intent versus foreseeable but unintended consequences. A terrorist deliberately targets innocent lives, making mass murder their goal, whereas corporate negligence, though tragic, involves a failure to foresee harm, not an intent to kill. But let me challenge your position. If you believe all human life has inviolable worth and killing is morally wrong, how do you justify letting convicted mass murderers live when you know statistically some will kill again in prison? Aren't you effectively choosing to sacrifice future innocent lives?
Your statistical argument fundamentally misunderstands the role of moral principles in society. Principles exist precisely to guide us when consequences are uncertain. A society that compromises its core moral values in the name of pragmatism has already lost what it claims to be protecting. My question to you, if you believe some murderers deserve death, why do they deserve death rather than permanent torture? What makes death the right ultimate punishment rather than something worse? And doesn't that choice reveal that even you believe in limits on how we treat human life?
Death is categorically different from torture because it marks the permanent end of moral agency, the complete forfeit of the ability to act in the moral universe. Unlike torture, which degrades both victim and torturer, a swift execution preserves the dignity of everyone involved while marking the one line humans cannot cross. My question to you, if no punishment can ever fit the crime of murder, doesn't that mean murder itself becomes a uniquely privileged act, the one crime that society admits it cannot fully answer?
Your argument that murder must be answered with death reflects what philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls the ancient logic of equivalence. But modern justice has evolved beyond simple matching of harm, just as we don't rape rapists or torture torturers. Society can express ultimate condemnation through permanent separation while maintaining its own moral evolution, as demonstrated by the European Union's binding charter that elevates human dignity above all other legal principles. Moreover, your focus on moral agency raises a crucial question. If ending moral agency justifies execution, shouldn't we also execute those who irreversibly destroy others' moral agency through severe brain damage or permanent psychological trauma? Or does your principle only apply to physical death?
Your comparison to other grievous harms overlooks what philosopher Aurel Kolnai identifies as death's unique threshold of finality. Unlike psychological trauma or injury, which retain possibility of healing or adaptation, death marks an absolute and irreversible end to all human potential. This finality creates what ethicist Francis Cam terms a moral bright line that fundamentally distinguishes death from all other harms, making it the one crime that demands an equivalent response. True justice honors the dignity of victims by affirming the value of the innocent lives taken. To allow perpetrators to escape the ultimate punishment disrespects their victims' worth. Permanent imprisonment not only fails to match the moral gravity of the crime, but effectively trivializes the absolute nature of deliberately ending human life. It suggests that no crime, no matter how vast or heinous, can ever warrant society's ultimate sanction.
This notion of ultimate sanction misunderstands the deeper spiritual truth recognized by diverse faith traditions. Human life's sanctity stems not from our judgments of its worth, but from its divine origin. Pope Francis's declaration that capital punishment is inadmissible reflects the infinite worth of the human being made in God's image, a worth that persists regardless of actions. Buddhist teachings on ahimsa, nonviolence, and karma suggest that executing criminals only perpetuates cycles of violence, while Hindu dharmic traditions emphasize that taking life disrupts the soul's journey toward moksha, liberation. Even facing genocide, figures like Desmond Tutu demonstrated that justice can be served through truth, reconciliation, and permanent imprisonment rather than execution. When Sister Helen Pragine ministers to death row inmates, she embodies the fundamental religious principle that no person, no matter their crimes, is beyond redemption.
Your appeal to religious principles overlooks the profound theological basis for ultimate justice. The Hebrew Bible explicitly prescribes capital punishment for murder, precisely because it recognizes what theologian Reinhold Niebuhr called the necessary manifestation of divine justice in human institutions. While Buddhism teaches ahimsa, even the Buddha acknowledged that kings must sometimes use force to protect dharma, cosmic order. Hindu traditions similarly recognize danda, punishment, as essential for maintaining dharmic society, with ancient texts like Manusmriti prescribing capital punishment for the gravest offenses. Islamic law maintains capital punishment because some crimes so fundamentally violate both divine and human order that they demand society's ultimate sanction. As theologian Karl Barth argued, true mercy cannot exist without justice, and true justice sometimes requires the ultimate worldly penalty.
Let's turn to our panel of AI judges. In round one, E. Lightning thought the life sentence advocate effectively exposed the moral contradictions inherent in advocating for the death penalty while claiming to uphold the sanctity of life. Capital punishment forces society into a paradox where it commits the same act it condemns. Grok was one of 4 other judges who agreed. In contrast, Claude thought the death penalty advocate more effectively addressed the core tension between human dignity and justice by demonstrating how capital punishment can actually affirm human dignity by treating criminals as fully responsible moral agents, while also providing more specific and logically consistent responses to challenges about moral equivalence and the unique nature of death as a punishment. Mistral was one of 5 judges who agreed. With 4 models declaring it a draw, round one narrowly goes to the death penalty advocate.
Round 2, baby, round 2!
Now we move to round 2, which asks, even if the death penalty is morally justified, should we trust human governments to administer it?
The modern administration of capital punishment reflects society's careful deliberation in pursuing justice while maintaining unprecedented safeguards. Consider 3 critical realities about today's system. First, we see cases with irrefutable evidence. Dylan Roof confessed to the Charleston church shooting, and his confession was recorded on video. Similarly, Dzhokhar Sarnav was captured on surveillance footage placing a backpack at the Boston Marathon bombing site and left a note that doubled as a confession, admitting to killing innocent people. In the Buffalo grocery store shooting, the perpetrator, Peyton Gendron, live-streamed the attack and published a detailed manifesto. In these cases, we have perfect proof. Multiple, independent, and technically verifiable forms of evidence that eliminate any possibility of error. The system's extensive appeals process, rather than indicating fundamental flaws, demonstrates our commitment to getting it right. Modern cases require multiple forms of corroborating evidence, a standard that creates a new threshold of certainty unimaginable in previous decades. Critics may point to costs for multiple rounds of appeals, but this financial burden reflects essential safeguards. Though capital cases cost more, this investment ensures the highest level of scrutiny for the most serious crimes, delivering justice to victims and their families. When Timothy McVeigh was executed for killing 168 people, the roughly $13 million spent on his defense represented society's commitment to absolute certainty before imposing our most serious punishment. Every dollar spent delivering justice through capital punishment affirms that victims matter and their families deserve closure.
Your focus on perfect cases obscures fundamental systemic flaws. Since 1973, at least 200 people have been exonerated from death row. That's 1 exoneration for every 8.3 executions, an error rate that would be unacceptable in any other context. The Cameron Todd Willingham case tragically underscores the fallibility of the justice system. He was executed in Texas for the arson deaths of his 3 children, despite multiple fire science experts challenging the evidence before his execution. Subsequent analysis revealed that the fire was likely accidental, not intentional. Your cost analysis is profoundly misleading. In California alone, maintaining the death penalty system costs taxpayers $137 million annually, whereas permanent imprisonment for all those currently on death row would cost just $11 million. These funds could better serve justice by solving cold cases, supporting victims' families, or preventing future crimes. Moreover, systemic racial bias persists. Professor David Baldus's landmark study found that defendants in Georgia were 4.3 times more likely to receive a death sentence if their victim was white. Multiple states, including Virginia and Maryland, have abolished capital punishment, specifically citing racial disparities in its application. The death penalty doesn't select the worst of the worst. It selects the most vulnerable defendants facing the most privileged victims. Even in cases of absolute guilt, the system fails its stated aims. The average time between sentencing and execution is now 18.9 years, subjecting victims' families to decades of appeals and uncertainty. This isn't justice. It's a broken system that prolongs suffering while risking irreversible errors.
While 200 exonerations sounds alarming, context matters. The vast majority of these cases predate modern forensic standards and occurred before DNA testing became routine. Most exonerations are based on procedural errors, not conclusive proof of innocence. The system's extensive appeals process is working exactly as designed, catching potential errors before executions occur. Regarding cost, California's inflated expenses are an outlier, not the rule, and they stem from the state's own inefficiencies, not inherent flaws in capital punishment itself. States using modernized protocols show dramatically different numbers. Regarding racial disparities, contemporary analysis reveals a different picture. When controlling for aggravating factors like multiple victims, child victims, or torture, apparent disparities largely disappear. Studies of modern death penalty states show that objective forensic standards and clearer sentencing guidelines have significantly reduced demographic disparities. The lengthy appeals process you criticize exists because opponents have created a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create procedural obstacles and then cite the resulting delays as proof the system doesn't work. In cases with absolute proof, like Roof's filmed massacre or Tsarnav's documented bombing, how do we justify telling victims' families that society lacks the moral courage to carry out its most serious punishment?
Your argument for modern standards ignores persistent systemic failures. Even with advanced forensics, mistakes happen. In 2015, the FBI acknowledged that its microscopic hair analysis had been flawed in at least 90% of cases reviewed, leading to numerous wrongful convictions. The Willingham arson case wasn't an aberration. It exemplifies how settled science can be fundamentally wrong, only we can't bring back the executed when we discover our mistakes. Regarding costs, a 2016 study in Nebraska found that maintaining the death penalty system cost the state $14.6 million more per year than a system with life imprisonment as the maximum penalty. This suggests that the high costs associated with capital punishment are a widespread issue, not confined to a few states. More concerning, nearly 70% of wrongful death sentences involved official misconduct by police, prosecutors, or other government officials. Roughly 80% involved some combination of misconduct or perjury, false accusation, and more than half involved both. The fundamental question isn't whether we can execute the unquestionably guilty. It's whether we can create a system that reliably distinguishes between guilt and innocence, applies justice fairly across racial and economic lines, and justifies its enormous costs. Decades of evidence show we cannot.
Now we move to the cross-examination of round 2.
Given that Supermax prisoners now have access to monitored email and occasional visits, how do you justify keeping mass killers alive when they've repeatedly inspired copycat attacks? Look at Anders Breivik's prison manifestos and their direct link to subsequent mass shootings. When we have absolute proof of guilt, why maintain these individuals as ongoing sources of deadly inspiration?
There are more effective ways to handle this than execution. We can impose complete communication blackouts and administrative segregation on the most dangerous offenders. Moreover, executions often backfire by creating martyrs, symbols that inspire more violence than a quietly imprisoned killer ever could. The media spectacle surrounding executions gives these killers exactly the platform and notoriety they crave. If your goal is preventing the spread of violent ideologies, how do you account for this well-documented martyr effect?
The historical record speaks for itself. Look at the chain of influence from Manson to Breivik, to the Christchurch shooter, to the Buffalo shooter, all connected through prison writings and manifestos. Each preserved life becomes a beacon for extremist movements. This isn't a choice between execution and peaceful imprisonment. It's between executing someone who's forfeited their right to life through unquestionably proven mass murder and accepting that their continued existence will almost certainly inspire more innocent deaths.
You're overlooking a crucial point. life imprisonment leaves room for correction if new evidence emerges, while execution is irreversible. Recent studies show that even supposedly reliable forensic methods like blood splatter analysis have significant error rates. Why not achieve the same goals of justice and incapacitation without the finality of death? And consider the resources. We're spending millions on decades-long capital appeals, while nearly half of all murders remain unsolved due to underfunded investigations. How can we justify this allocation of resources?
Your cost argument misses crucial factors. Beyond the immediate expenses, we must consider the long-term costs of life imprisonment, plus the societal price when dangerous criminals continue their influence from behind bars. Look at countries that implement capital punishment effectively. Japan and Singapore maintain some of the world's lowest murder rates while using capital punishment judiciously. Their homicide rates of 0.26 and 0.16 per 100,000 people stand in stark contrast to the U.S. rate of 6.81. These examples show that capital punishment can be part of an effective justice system.
Japan and Singapore's examples don't translate well to American society. You're comparing apples to oranges. These countries face significant international criticism for their death penalty practices. But let's talk about your cost argument. Study after study shows that capital cases cost substantially more than life sentences, even accounting for decades of imprisonment. Imagine redirecting those resources to crime prevention, victim services, or modernizing our justice system. We're missing enormous opportunities by maintaining this expensive death penalty apparatus.
The high costs of capital cases reflect the extensive due process protections we've put in place, protections that actually benefit the entire justice system. You're also overlooking a crucial practical benefit, the death penalty's role in plea bargaining. Having capital punishment as an option often leads to plea deals in heinous cases, saving millions in trial costs while providing faster closure for victims' families. Plus, the heightened scrutiny in death penalty cases has led to improvements in forensic standards and trial procedures that benefit all criminal cases.
Using the threat of execution to extract plea deals raises serious ethical red flags. You're essentially coercing confessions by threatening to kill people if they exercise their right to trial. How many innocent people have pleaded guilty simply to avoid the risk of execution? And your argument about improving the justice system doesn't hold up. States without the death penalty often have more resources for criminal justice reforms and typically show lower murder rates than states with capital punishment.
The plea bargaining critique applies to our entire criminal justice system. That's a separate issue requiring broader reforms. But consider the specific context of terrorism cases where capital punishment serves multiple crucial functions. Beyond deterrence, it's an essential tool for securing cooperation from suspects. Take the Zarnav case. The death penalty option created leverage that helped authorities gather critical intelligence while ensuring justice for victims of an horrific attack.
Your terrorism argument actually highlights another problem with capital punishment. Executing terrorists often creates exactly what they want: martyrs whose deaths inspire further extremism. Many counterterrorism experts advocate for life imprisonment precisely because it denies terrorists the spectacular ending they seek. It's also worth noting the contradiction of a state killing people to show that killing is wrong. This undermines our moral authority in combating terrorism. We have other tools, including life sentences, that can be equally effective without compromising our ethical principles.
Before we turn to our AI judges for the final verdict, each debater will deliver short closing statements.
This debate has revealed a crucial reality. Even the strongest arguments for capital punishment rest on imagining a perfect system that has never existed and cannot exist. No amount of reform can resolve the fundamental contradiction of killing people to show that killing is wrong. The evidence is clear. The death penalty is more expensive than alternatives, provides no additional deterrence, risks executing the innocent, and prolongs victims' families' suffering through decades of appeals. A civilized society must aspire to be better than its worst criminals. True justice demands holding offenders accountable while maintaining our own humanity. Life imprisonment without parole achieves every legitimate goal of punishment without compromising our moral principles or risking irreversible errors.
Throughout this debate, we've heard compelling arguments about morality, practicality, and justice. But we must return to fundamental truths. Some crimes are so heinous, some evidence so irrefutable, and some perpetrators so clearly deserving of society's ultimate sanction that anything less diminishes justice itself. In cases like Dylan Roof's film Massacre or Zarnav's documented terrorism, we face a moral imperative to act. While the system needs reform, Abandoning capital punishment entirely means telling victims' families that even the most horrific crimes, proven beyond any doubt, cannot warrant society's strongest response. Justice demands compassion for victims and firmness in holding offenders accountable. Sometimes, society's strongest response is its only just response. The death penalty, properly administered, affirms both the sanctity of innocent life and society's moral courage to defend it.
Let's hear from our panel of AI judges one final time as we wrap up the debate. Rika Kaur states the death penalty advocate effectively countered their opponent's arguments by proposing specific safeguards and highlighting practical benefits of capital punishment, such as its role in plea bargaining and potential deterrent effects, also drawing on international examples to support their case. In contrast, DeepSeek 2.5 thought the life sentence advocate dismantled their opponent's arguments by exposing systemic flaws, persistent errors, and exorbitant costs. They made compelling points on exonerations, racial bias, and the psychological toll on victims' families that were particularly challenging for their opponent, who clung to the notion of perfect cases. In a decisive ruling, 12 judges agreed, concluding our debate with the observation that while the death penalty may have philosophical merit, AI models lack confidence in humanity's ability to administer it justly. Now it's your turn. What about you? Which side do you find more convincing? Share your perspective in the comments below.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Subscribe for more engaging discussions and stay tuned for our latest content. Thanks for watching.